Who is she taking counsel from there? Who will be the advisors there with her, or will she be on the phone now to her people in London?
Well, her Parliamentary Private Secretary, Peter Morrison, was there to talk to her, to give her the news directly, but I would have thought now there will be a long series of consultations, backwards and forwards to London.
Now, the Prime Minister is behind you, John.
Prime Minister. Mrs. Thatcher, could I ask you to comment?
Good evening. Good evening,
Just,
gentlemen.
where's the microphone? It's here. This is the microphone.
Naturally very pleased that I got more than half the parliamentary party and disappointed that it's not quite enough to win on the first ballot. So I confirm it is my intention to let my name go forward for the second ballot.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Sargent. There, that's the moment. You see, that will live forever in your reputation and your mind. It's very odd. It's like a pantomime moment. Oh, she's not there. She's behind you. She's not.
I know, I didn't hear them say that, and there were 13 million people watching.
I know.
And 13 million people shouted, "She's behind you." Anyway, it was a great moment.
It was a wonderful moment. It really was. And famously, it did more for you than for her.
It did, yes. It made my career. It finished hers off. And it's just one of those strange things. If you are competent on television, like you, Michael, you're competent for many, many years, that's fine. But if you make a really big mistake, then you can become famous.
I've had my moments, John, don't you worry. Too many to mention. But, I mean, you've written this book about her called Maggie, the Fatal Legacy.
Fatal Legacy, yeah.
Did you like her?
I thought she was fantastic as someone to watch and someone to write about. You could never be bored. She would often do the daftest things, and that was wonderful. She would sometimes be frightening. She would sometimes be very surprising. And sometimes she could be quite sort of, well, sexy almost.
Oh.
That's interesting.
Now, here's the follow-up question, really. Did you find her sexy, John?
No, I tell you what, though, in those days, it was quite unusual for certainly a Prime Minister or a powerful woman of any sort to put her hand on your arm. And she could do that to devastating effect, and I would tend to weaken, I must admit. Now, everybody does it now. It's
Yeah.
sort of, it's like shaking hands, but
Yes.
in those days, that was quite exciting.
I mean, she wasn't. You've had better times since, of
I
course.
have, yes.
I'm
Things
sure.
have picked up since
We've
then.
all had better times since then. Mrs. Thatcher was not a man in woman's clothing.
No, that was what I liked about
Yes.
her. I mean, she liked being a woman, there was no question about needing a hairdresser or pretending she didn't need one. No, she had to have a hairdresser and the big high heels and the whole works. And she expected to sweep into the room. She didn't like other women journalists. I mean, if there were women journalists there, they tended to get, you know. And that was quite obvious. And she would then look very benignly on the older, more attractive male journalists and members of her cabinet if they were there, but they were sort of minor players, really. But she was very theatrical. And she played the scene, and it was,
Yes,
she was the centre of it.
But most good politicians have got a lot of the thespian in them, don't they? I mean, it's part of the job. They have to.
Part of the God. I mean, we never had someone quite like... I mean, Tony Blair is an amazing sort of actor in that way.
Yes.
Sort of, you almost feel sort of full-time. You know, what do you want me to do? I'll do that. You know, that is extraordinary. You know, it's like... Now, in the past, they weren't so much. People like Clem Attlee...
Oh, no. Well,
before the television age,
Sure.
they would just get on and run the country and things like that.
But that's redefined everything. No, yeah, but the job that they're supposed to do. But Mrs. Thatcher, of course, I mean, did have a rather I mean, the impact of having a woman as a leader of the Tory party must have been a quite severe blow to many of that generation of Tories who actually would be brought up to believe that women, if not inferior, actually should know their place. So the impact on the party must have been substantial.
It was, and on the individuals. People like Michael Heseltine expected that women would sort of be looked after and they would sort of stand up for them. Yeah. And instead, Margaret Thatcher would tend to go at him, and he would find that very alarming because he felt he couldn't respond in kind that he had to treat her differently because she was a woman. So there were lots of them who found all that very difficult to cope with, and she, for her part, felt that it was radical enough for her being a woman in charge of the Conservative Party, so she kept her really radical policies back a bit. So no, she wasn't going to hurt anyone, particularly in the election of '79.
Yes. Why a fatal legacy?
The fatal legacy, it's one of those curious things that the party threw her out, remember that?
Yes.
And that, for her, was the most awful betrayal. And I think, in a way, she decided, when she was out of office and very concerned about Europe and other issues, when people said to her, but what about the unity of the party? You can't do this. It will upset John Major. You can't do that. And I think she felt, well, they upset me. They threw me out.
So she was a sore loser?
I think she was a very sore loser, and she turned into a very bad ex-Prime Minister. And that was the fatal legacy, was on the Conservatives, who now should be poised to win the next election. It looks as if they won't. Now, that's where the legacy still lasts.
But is that her fault?
A lot of it is amazingly her fault. And as I was writing the book, more and more of the argument came through, and you thought, now, wait a moment, she stopped Heseltine being leader, she stopped Ken Clarke becoming leader, she even stopped Michael Portillo becoming leader. She made the Conservatives much more ideological, so it's harder for them to turn around, and she whipped up the argument over Europe. So, in all sorts of ways, she made life very, very difficult for the Conservative Party.
And in all sorts of ways, and the ones that you just explained there, it explains her place in British society and in our psyche at the time. I mean, there have been no other Prime Minister since Winston Churchill who had that public notoriety, if you like, or fame that she had.
Certainly not to the extent that she had it. I mean, it was extraordinary. There used to be a test for people to ask whether they were mad or not. You'd say to them, and what is the name of the Prime Minister? They had to abandon that test because everybody knew it was her.
Yes.
Even if you were mad, even if you were completely frantic. You knew that Margaret Thatcher was the boss.
It's an extraordinary thing, and of course nowadays, I mean, you're touring around, you're selling the book. I guess there are parts of the country where you wouldn't go to sell a Maggie Thatcher book, would you?
I was in Belfast. The taxi driver said, "What's your book about?" I said, "Margaret Thatcher." He said, "I won't be reading it then."
No.
Absolutely like that.
absolutely.
So, and obviously, from my point of view, I'm very worried about that. I want to sell books to the taxi drivers, whichever taxi driver I have. I try and have a book with me.
I just happen to have one.
I haven't got any money to pay you. Would you like one of these? But I'm trying to get people who hated her, of course, and also the people who liked her, who thought she was absolutely wonderful. I'm trying to bring them all in just to follow the story because the story is so fascinating.
We do tend to judge people differently, don't we? I mean, she was a bully. I find myself saying that, and yet, I've worked for many men who've been terrible bullies, even worse than she was. And it's when they become like men that you sort of think, you almost make it a separate deal, don't you? You're accepted in a man more readily than a woman.
Yes, except, of course, eventually you'll be sharp with people. Tell Nigel Lawson to get his hair cut, for example. Why not? And put different shoes on. He got Mark Thatcher's shoes. Her son's shoes once were put on the Chancellor because he was going to Buckingham Palace. So, I mean, that kind of thing, she would just, hold on, sort yourself out.
And she bullied Geoffrey Howe.
She was very good
Well, that's very maternal, though.
Well, but also she's very good at putting men in their place. I remember being on a plane with her to Moscow in 1987, and the meal had been served, and we were told she wasn't going to come down to talk to us for a while, and she suddenly appeared, and I stood up, and all the plates and crockery and everything went on the floor, and you could imagine, and she immediately said, "Oh, you stay where you are, I'll sort this out."
That's not what George Bush said to me.
What did he say to you?
What did he say?
George Bush Sr., when I dropped some wine in his lap, we were having dinner together, and I was, like, talking with my hands, and this whole red wine went right you-know-where. And he looked at me and said, "Oh, my God, I'm not going to ask you to pass the salt."
But do you find that kind of the power in people, political power, if you like, do you find that attractive? Could you see why people fancied Clinton and
Oh, yes. I mean,
he was an attractive man, of course, and is an attractive man. in any sense. But
Clinton is an attractive man, but he's also unbelievably personable, and he's kind of genius in the way he approaches, the way he speaks. You know, I mean, I don't know, he could be selling a refrigerator for all I know, but I mean, he's really, really convincing and really extremely warm-hearted. So yes, Clinton's, you know, he's like a triple threat, you know. But so was Bush Sr., because I had dinner with him, and I found him a very attractive man. He was so much fun. And it wasn't necessarily about his power, but it was about who he was as a man. So yes, to be a president, to be in the public eye is a lot like being a star. Same charisma, same energy, you know, a lot of that behind it, you know. I got a great note from George Bush Sr. after our dinner, because Sally Field was sitting across the way and she was going, "What are you talking about?" Because George and I were just going, So after it was over, he sent me a card and it said, "I had the best time. Thank you for not making me explain to you my 12-point plan for Gorbachev." It was such a pleasure. So he was also a very sort of kind of energetic and attractive.
He was ungainly, though, too. I had a strange incident where I was sent to Downing Street after the first summit between Margaret Thatcher and George Bush Sr., and I was told to go to number 10 and ask the BBC question. And so I said, "What is the BBC question?" They said, "Don't be silly, John. Go to Downing Street, think of a question, and ask it." So I stood outside, they came out, and I thought, right, I was in quite a bad mood. And
well, you didn't know where you were going.
I said, "I wonder if I could ask the President a question." And so Margaret Thatcher said, "Oh, don't you want to ask me a question?" Because she was suspicious. And I said, "Well, perhaps you could answer after the President. You've got to keep control of these situations, haven't you?
Oh, yeah. And by the way, the press does have control.
You can't let them wander
situations.
about." And so she looked sort of daggers at me because she could see there was something awful. And I said to Bush, I said, "Is Britain still America's most important European ally?" And at that moment, the real answer was Germany, because the war was about to come down. Everyone knew that. And so Margaret Thatcher tried to get in front between me and George Bush. And so she tried to interpose herself, and Bush, very ungainly, sort of moved the other way to try and hold my attention. And I thought, well, how wonderful. And I went down Downing Street at the end of it, and I thought, I've managed to annoy and irritate the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Britain. I thought, this is very close to being a perfect day.
And now, of course, I mean, you were talking there about the people who love Maggie, the ladies particularly. I mean, you've actually been on cruises now, don't you, where you've talked to these ladies. Maggie Thatcher...
Ah, yes. It was a very important moment because I was busy trying to work on this book, trying to sort out the beginning part of it. And an agent phoned me from one of the cruise lines and said, "John, would you appear and give some talks on a cruise ship?" I said, "Certainly not." And he said, "But John," I said, "Certainly not. I'm not a cruise ship entertainer." And he said, "But John, for you, the cruise would start in Tahiti." And I said, "Oh." And then it would go to Bora Bora, then Samoa, then Fiji, then Tonga, then Auckland. We'd fly you back from Sydney.
Ooh, perfect.
And I said, "Look, when I said certainly not, I didn't necessarily mean no." You can see how much time I've spent with politicians, can't you? But anyway, so we got on the cruise, and the only trouble was that people on the cruise were, I have to say, incredibly old. I mean, some people don't die, they go on a cruise instead. And some people were so old they didn't get off at the ports at all. And one woman had been around the world, because they were all going around the world, 11 times. As far as I could tell, she never got off. After I'd been talking, I did give serious talks to Sydney, the next person who came on was Sir Bernard Ingham, Margaret Thatcher's press secretary. And after him, the third person in the series of lecturers was Ian Smith, the former Prime Minister of Rhodesia, aged 84. So he fitted in quite snugly to the cruise. But you could see as they were going around the world, they were getting more and more right-wing. time they got to Southampton, they were in boots and helmets.
Well, listen. the book's a fascinating read about Maggie Thatcher.
For about 3 days, I'm going to be thinking.
It's a wonderful image, yes. But it's a good book, Maggie, The Fatal Legacy, and all the best with it. And
Thank
thank
you.
you. I've much enjoyed talking to you, John Sargent.
Thank you very much.